July 6, 371 BCE, the plain of Leuctra in Boeotia, central Greece. The morning sun cast long shadows across two armies, preparing for a battle that would shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility and redraw the power structure of the Greek world. On one side stood the army of Sparta, the most feared military force in Greece for over 2 centuries, led by King Cleombrotus I. On the other, the Thebans under Epaminondas, a philosopher-general who was about to revolutionize warfare with tactics so radical that his own allies questioned his sanity. What happened on that dusty plain would influence military thinking for the next 2,000 years, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the story of how innovation defeated tradition, how intellect triumphed over reputation, and how 300 men in the Sacred Band became the tip of a spear that broke the back of Spartan power forever. To understand the magnitude of what occurred at Leuctra, you must first grasp what Sparta represented in 371 BCE. For over 200 years, Sparta had been the dominant land power in Greece. Their hoplites, the heavily armoured infantry that formed the backbone of Greek armies, were considered unbeatable in pitched battle. Spartan warriors began their military training at age 7, lived in barracks until age 30, and devoted their entire existence to warfare. The Agog, Sparta's brutal training system, produced soldiers so disciplined and fearless that other Greek states trembled at the sight of their crimson cloaks and lambda shields. The Spartans had crushed Athens in the Peloponnesian War. They had humiliated Thebes repeatedly, garrisoning the Theban citadel of Cadmea and imposing oligarchic governments favourable to Spartan interests. By 371 BCE, Spartan hegemony over Greece seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. But hegemonies built on military reputation alone are fragile things, and cracks were appearing in Sparta's foundation. The devastating earthquake of 464 BCE had killed thousands of Spartan citizens, a loss from which their notoriously low birth rate never recovered. The Helot revolt that followed had further drained Spartan manpower. The losses at the Battle of Sphacteria during the Peloponnesian War, where 120 Spartan citizens surrendered rather than fight to the death, had shocked the Greek world and planted seeds of doubt about Spartan invincibility. By 371 BCE, Sparta could field perhaps 8,000 Spartan citizens and perioikoi, their free non-citizen subjects, along with allied contingents. Still formidable, but no longer the overwhelming force of previous generations. Thebes, meanwhile, had been systematically humiliated by Sparta for decades. In 382 BCE, Spartan forces had seized the Cadmea, Thebes' Acropolis, through treachery during peacetime. For nearly 3 years, a Spartan garrison occupied the heart of the city, a violation of Greek norms so blatant that even Sparta's allies were embarrassed. When Theban exiles finally liberated their city in 379 BCE, driving out the Spartan garrison and killing the oligarchs who had collaborated with them, Sparta's response was predictable and brutal. They launched a series of invasions designed to bring Thebes to heel once and for all. It was during these years of constant warfare that Thebes forged itself into something unprecedented. Under the leadership of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes didn't just resist Sparta, it reimagined how wars could be fought. Epaminondas was no typical Greek general. He was a philosopher who had studied under Pythagorean teachers, a man who quoted Homer and understood mathematics, a warrior who thought deeply about the nature of combat itself. Ancient sources describe him as living simply despite his prominence, wearing plain clothes and eating modest meals, devoted entirely to his city's liberation. He saw what others missed, that Spartan tactics hadn't fundamentally changed in generations, that their strength was also their predictability, and that innovation could defeat tradition if applied with sufficient intelligence and courage. The immediate cause of the battle was a failed peace conference at Sparta in the summer of 371 BCE. The Spartans, exhausted by constant warfare and facing threats on multiple fronts, had proposed a general peace treaty. Epaminondas attended as head of the Theban delegation. When the Spartans insisted that Thebes sign the treaty on behalf of itself alone, not as representative of the entire Boeotian League, Epaminondas refused. Thebes had spent years unifying Boeotia under its leadership, creating a federal structure that pooled the resources of numerous cities. To sign as Thebes alone would be to abandon that union and accept Spartan domination. The Spartan king Agesilaus, furious at what he saw as Theban arrogance, struck Thebes from the treaty. This meant war. King Cleombrotus, commanding a Spartan army that had been stationed in Phocis watching Thebes, received orders to invade Boeotia and crush Theban power once and for all. His force was substantial, 4 morai of Spartan hoplites, the elite core of their army, perhaps 700 Spartan citizens supported by perioikoi and allied contingents from cities across the Peloponnese. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, but modern historians estimate Cleombrotus commanded approximately 10,000 to 11,000 men. More importantly, he commanded Spartans, warriors who had never lost a major hoplite battle in living memory. Confidence among the Spartan ranks was absolute. They were marching to deliver yet another lesson to upstart Thebes. Epaminondas and the Thebans knew Cleombrotus was coming. They had perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 men, significantly outnumbered by the Spartan coalition. Worse, they had to convince their Boeotian allies, cities like Thespiae and Plataea that harboured old grudges against Theban dominance, to stand and fight rather than scatter before the Spartan advance. Many of these allies had no desire to face Spartan spears. The odds looked grim. Traditional Greek warfare offered little hope. Hoplite battles followed a predictable pattern. 2 phalanxes, dense formations of armoured spearmen standing shield to shield, would advance toward each other. The right wing of each army, where the best troops traditionally stood, and where each man's unshielded right side was protected by his neighbour's shield, would typically push back the enemy's weaker left wing. The battle would be decided by which right wing could wheel around and attack the enemy centre from behind. Spartans excelled at this conventional approach. Their discipline, their training, their cohesion were unmatched. In a standard hoplite battle, Thebes would be crushed, so Epaminondas decided not to fight a standard hoplite battle. What he conceived was so radical that when he proposed it to his officers, many thought he had lost his mind. He would reverse everything that Greek warfare considered normal. He would make his left wing, traditionally the weakest part of any phalanx, into the strongest. He would refuse his right wing, holding it back from engagement. He would concentrate overwhelming force at a single point and smash through the Spartan line with a depth of formation never before attempted. And he would use the Sacred Band, Thebes' elite unit of 300 warriors, as the spear point of this devastating thrust. The Sacred Band deserves special attention because they were unlike any military unit in the Greek world. Formed around 378 BCE, possibly by Gorgidas or Pelopidas, the Sacred Band consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total, bound together by both military discipline and erotic bonds. Greek homosexuality, particularly in military contexts, was different from modern conceptions. These were relationships between older warriors, the Erastes or lover, and younger men, the Eromenos or beloved, relationships that Theban culture saw as producing superior soldiers. The theory, articulated by Plato and other philosophers, was that men would fight with unmatched courage when their lovers watched, that shame before one's beloved was more powerful than fear of death, and that each man would die to protect his partner. The Sacred Band proved this theory correct again and again. They fought as a unit, never scattered among other formations, and their courage became legendary. By 371 BCE, they were the finest heavy infantry unit in Greece, perhaps in the world. The plain of Leuctra offered good ground for the battle Epaminondas envisioned. Open terrain without significant obstacles, enough space for formations to deploy, and positioned where Cleombrotus would have to fight or admit that his invasion had failed. The Spartans arrived and saw the Thebans drawn up for battle. Cleombrotus must have been pleased. The Thebans were accepting battle rather than retreating behind their walls. This would be the decisive engagement that Sparta's strategy required. He ordered his forces into the traditional formation, Spartan citizens and perioikoi on the right wing, the position of honour approximately 12 ranks deep. Allied contingents spread across the centre and left, probably 8 to 12 ranks deep. Cavalry on the flanks, though cavalry in this period was more for screening and pursuit than decisive combat. The formation was solid, professional, exactly what you would expect from the greatest military power in Greece. What Cleombrotus saw across the field must have seemed strange but not immediately threatening. The Theban army was deployed at an angle, Their left wing advanced toward the Spartan right, their right wing refused, held back and angled away from contact. The Theban left wing appeared unusually deep, perhaps 30 to 40 ranks or even deeper. Ancient sources vary. At the very front of this massive column were the Sacred Band, 300 men in their prime, armoured in the finest bronze, carrying spears and the distinctive Boeotian shields, determined to smash through the Spartans or die trying. Behind them stood thousands of Theban hoplites, packed so tightly that the rear ranks could physically push the front ranks forward. This was the oblique order that would revolutionize warfare, concentration of force at the decisive point while refusing engagement elsewhere. Cleombrotus may not have fully understood what he was seeing. The depth of the Theban left was unusual but not necessarily alarming. Greek commanders sometimes varied their depth based on troop quality. The refused right wing was more puzzling, but perhaps the Thebans were weak there and trying to minimize their disadvantage. What wasn't immediately obvious was that Epaminondas had created a tactical hammer designed to strike with overwhelming force at the strongest point of the Spartan line. Traditional wisdom said you used your strong right to defeat the enemy's weak left. Epaminondas was using his strong left to destroy the enemy's strong right, decapitating Spartan command and breaking their morale in one devastating blow. The battle began with a cavalry skirmish. Both sides had cavalry screening their flanks, perhaps a few hundred horsemen on each side. Greek cavalry in this period were not the decisive shock troops they would become under Alexander. They were scouts, skirmishers, and pursuit forces, useful but not battle-winning. The Theban cavalry, however, were better trained than their Spartan counterparts. Sparta's mounted forces had always been something of an afterthought, wealthy citizens on horses but without the rigorous training that made Spartan infantry supreme. In the swirling cavalry fight that opened the battle, the Thebans drove back the Spartan horsemen, pushing them into the gaps and flanks of the Spartan infantry formation, creating confusion and disrupting the neat deployment Cleombrotus had prepared. Then the Theban left wing advanced. Imagine standing in the Spartan right wing, a veteran warrior who had faced spear walls a dozen times, watching this massive column of Theban infantry bearing down on you, the ground trembling with thousands of footfalls, the sun glinting off bronze helmets and shield faces, the Sacred Band at the front, their white tunics and red cloaks marking them as Thebes' elite, their formation tight as a clenched fist. Behind them, rank after rank of Theban hoplites, 40 or 50 men deep, a human battering ram advancing at the steady pace trained hoplites used to maintain formation. The Spartan right wing was 12 ranks deep, the standard deployment, men who had trained together for years, officers who knew their business, warriors who had never retreated in battle. They locked their shields together in the orthismos position, prepared to receive the Theban charge. Their spears, 7 to 8 feet long, projected from the shield wall. The front ranks would take the initial impact, the rear ranks would push, and Spartan discipline and skill would prevail as it always had. Except nothing in their experience had prepared them for what came next. The Sacred Band struck the Spartan right wing like a bronze-sheathed avalanche. The initial collision of spear points and shields, what Greeks called the first shock, was devastating. The depth of the Theban formation meant that the pressure behind the front ranks was immense, physically pushing the Sacred Band forward even as Spartans tried to hold their ground. Spears shattered, shields cracked. Men in the front ranks of both sides died within seconds, trampled or pierced, but the Thebans kept coming. Where a Spartan in the front rank fell, the man behind him stepped forward, only to face not one but 5 or 6 Thebans pressing forward, spears stabbing, shields ramming, the weight of 40 ranks behind them inexorable. King Cleombrotus, positioned with the Spartan right wing as was traditional for a commanding officer, found himself in the centre of this maelstrom. He fought bravely by all accounts. Ancient sources describe him cutting down multiple Thebans, trying to rally his men, attempting to hold the line through personal example. But courage couldn't overcome mathematics. The Sacred Band and the Theban column behind them were grinding through the Spartan ranks, through sheer pressure and violence. Cleombrotus went down, mortally wounded. Accounts differ on whether he died immediately or was carried from the field to expire shortly after. His death sent shockwaves through the Spartan line. A Spartan king dying in battle was rare enough, but to fall in the initial clash, overwhelmed by Theban spears, was psychologically devastating. Around the dying king, the polemarchs, Sparta's senior military officers, tried desperately to hold the line and protect their monarch. This was where Sparta's command structure became a fatal weakness. The polemarchs positioned themselves at the front of the formation, leading by example as Spartan tradition demanded. This made them targets. As the Sacred Band pushed deeper into the Spartan ranks, these senior officers were killed one after another. Ancient sources report that 1 or 2 polemarchs fell in rapid succession. Possibly as many as 400 of the Spartan elite died in this grinding melee. The command structure was being systematically destroyed. The mathematics of the oblique order were playing out exactly as Epaminondas had planned. While the Theban left crushed the Spartan right, the Theban right wing remained far back, refusing contact with the Spartan left and centre. The Spartan allies facing this refused wing, seeing nothing immediately threatening them, hesitated. Should they advance and try to roll up the Theban centre? Should they march toward the sounds of battle on their right and try to support the struggling Spartans? But moving in formation across a battlefield was difficult and time-consuming, and by the time the Spartan centre understood what was happening, it was already too late. The Spartan right wing was disintegrating, with their king dead, their senior officers fallen, and the Sacred Band literally pushing them backwards step by step. The Spartans did something unthinkable. They began to retreat. At first it was the rear ranks, men who could step back without immediately facing Theban spears. Then the middle ranks trying to create space, trying to reform. Then the front ranks, overwhelmed and exhausted, turning and moving back. Retreat for Spartans was almost unheard of. Their entire culture was built around standing firm or dying in place. The laws of Lycurgus, the semi-mythical founder of Spartan society, supposedly forbade retreat. Spartan mothers told their sons to come home with their shields or on them, meaning victorious or dead. But here at Leuctra, faced with a tactical situation they had no answer for, the Spartan right wing broke. Once the Spartans began falling back, the psychological dominance they had held over Greek warfare for 2 centuries began to crumble. The Spartan allies in the centre and left, seeing the vaunted Spartan right in retreat, saw no reason to stand and fight. They began retreating as well, first in order, then with increasing haste as the realization spread that the battle was lost. The Thebans pursued, but not recklessly. Epaminondas maintained control of his forces, preventing the wild pursuit that often led to ambush and reversal. The Spartans fell back to a defensive position on some rising ground nearby, probably a low hill that offered tactical advantage for defense. The casualties tell the story of the battle's one-sided nature. Ancient sources report that 400 Spartan citizens died at Leuctra, out of perhaps 700 engaged. This was a catastrophic loss for a society that could ill afford to lose any citizens, given their low population. Some modern historians question these numbers, suggesting they may be exaggerated, but even if the actual number was lower, the proportional loss was devastating. The Theban losses were minimal, perhaps 300 men total, most of those probably from the Sacred Band and front ranks of the left wing that had borne the brunt of the fighting. The disparity in casualties showed that this wasn't a hard-fought battle between equals. It was tactical innovation systematically destroying traditional methods. The immediate aftermath saw the Spartans trapped. They had retreated to defensible ground, but they had lost the battle, lost their king, lost hundreds of irreplaceable citizens. The Thebans controlled the battlefield and could have potentially annihilated the remaining Spartan forces. But Epaminondas made a calculated decision. He allowed the Spartans to retrieve their dead under truce and then withdraw. This wasn't mercy. It was strategy. If the Spartans were annihilated to the last man, all of Greece might unite against Thebes out of fear. But if the Spartans were humiliated, bloodied, and sent home to report their defeat, the psychological impact would be even greater. News of Spartan defeat would spread faster than news of Spartan annihilation could be believed. The news reached Sparta during a festival, the Gymnopedii, where the city's youth performed ritual dances and songs celebrating Spartan military prowess. According to ancient sources, the Ephors, Sparta's senior magistrates, received messengers reporting the disaster. They decided to let the festival continue, announcing only that King Cleombrotus and certain citizens had fallen in battle, without immediately revealing the scale of the defeat. The families of the fallen were ordered to mourn privately, without public display. The families of survivors were forbidden to show joy. This attempt to control the narrative couldn't hide the magnitude of what had happened. Sparta had lost a pitched battle. The myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. The strategic consequences of Leuctra rippled across Greece like an earthquake. Within months, the Peloponnesian League, Sparta's network of alliances that had dominated southern Greece for centuries, began to dissolve. Cities that had followed Sparta out of fear or calculation now saw that Thebes offered an alternative. Epaminondas led Theban armies into the Peloponnese itself, something that would have been unthinkable before Leuctra. He encouraged the Helots, Sparta's enslaved population, to revolt and helped establish the city of Messene as a free state, permanently depriving Sparta of the agricultural base that had supported its citizen leisure class. Without Helot labour, Spartan citizens had to work their own land, leaving less time for military training, which meant fewer effective soldiers, which meant less power, a death spiral from which Sparta never recovered. The tactical innovations at Leuctra became the foundation of Greek and later Macedonian military doctrine. The oblique order, concentration of force at a decisive point while refusing engagement elsewhere, influenced military thinking for centuries. Philip of Macedon, held as a hostage in Thebes during the years after Leuctra, studied under Epaminondas or his successors and saw firsthand how the Sacred Band fought. When Philip later reformed the Macedonian army, he incorporated the lesson of concentrated force, using his pike-armed phalanx as the fixing force while his companion cavalry delivered the decisive blow on the flanks, the same principle Epaminondas had demonstrated. Alexander the Great, Philip's son, used variations of the oblique order throughout his campaigns in Asia. Napoleon Bonaparte studied Leuctra and called Epaminondas a genius. The German military theorist Hans Delbrück analysed the battle extensively. Every military academy in the world teaches the principles demonstrated at Leuctra, even if they don't always name the battle. But perhaps the most important lesson of Leuctra wasn't tactical. It was that innovation defeats tradition, that reputation without substance is hollow, and that military dominance built on past victories rather than present excellence will eventually crumble. The Spartans at Leuctra fought exactly as they had been taught, using formations and tactics refined over generations. They fought bravely and skillfully. It wasn't enough. Epaminondas had thought more deeply about the nature of combat than they had. He had questioned assumptions that everyone else accepted. He had dared to make his strong point attack their strong point, violating conventional wisdom, because he understood that concentration of force at the decisive moment mattered more than following established patterns. The human dimension of Leuctra deserves reflection. 400 Spartan citizens died in a single afternoon, men who had trained since childhood for this moment, whose entire lives had been shaped by military culture, who believed absolutely in their superiority and invincibility. Their courage in standing against the Sacred Band's charge wasn't questioned even by their enemies. Ancient sources describe Spartans fighting to the death around their fallen king, trying to protect his body as Greek honour demanded, but courage without effective tactics is just brave men dying. The Thebans who broke them were no less brave, but they had something the Spartans lacked that day, a plan that accounted for reality rather than reputation. Epaminondas himself is one of history's tragic heroes. After Leuctra, he led Thebes to its brief period of hegemony over Greece, liberating cities from Spartan domination, invading the Peloponnese multiple times, establishing Messene and Megalopolis as counterweights to Spartan power. But Theban dominance depended almost entirely on his genius. When he fell mortally wounded at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, just 9 years after Leuctra, leading another battle against Sparta, Theban power died with him. Ancient sources report that he pulled the spear from his wound only after confirming that his shield was safe, that Thebes had won the battle, and that his officers were prepared to carry on. He died believing he had secured his city's future. Within a generation, Thebes would be demolished by Alexander the Great, its population enslaved or scattered, its brief moment of glory remembered primarily through Epaminondas' battles. The Sacred Band continued fighting for Thebes until their final stand at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where they faced Philip of Macedon and the young Alexander. Surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered, the 300 fought to the death rather than surrender or retreat. Philip, surveying the battlefield after victory and finding the Sacred Bands dead piled together where they had made their last stand, reportedly wept and declared that anyone who thought these men had done or suffered anything shameful was worthy of condemnation. They were buried together in a common tomb that still exists. the Lion of Chaeronea, a monument to courage and the bonds of love and honour that made 300 men unbreakable even in death. Leuctra itself, the little Boeotian town where empires shifted, returned to obscurity after the battle. It was never a major city, just the place where history pivoted on a summer day in 371 BCE. Modern archaeological surveys have attempted to locate the exact battlefield, with varying levels of success. The plain is still there, though 2 millennia of agriculture have erased most traces of ancient combat. But the tactical principles demonstrated there remain as valid as ever. Concentration of force, attack the decisive point, refuse engagement where it doesn't serve your purpose, accept that innovation requires breaking established rules. These lessons, purchased with Spartan and Theban blood on a July afternoon, echo through military history. The battle also demonstrated something about the nature of military excellence. Sparta's system, for all its brutality and focus, had produced tactical stagnation. Their warriors were superbly trained, but trained to fight the previous war. They had perfected a system without evolving it. The Agog taught discipline, courage, and unit cohesion, all vital military virtues. But it didn't teach flexible thinking or tactical innovation. Spartan officers were expected to execute established doctrine, not question it. Epaminondas, product of a more intellectually open society, could think about warfare from first principles, could ask why battles were fought certain ways, could imagine alternatives that Spartan conditioning would never allow. This raises uncomfortable questions about military culture and institutional learning. How many armies throughout history have been destroyed not because their soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because their doctrine was obsolete and their leadership couldn't adapt? How many Leuctra-style defeats could have been avoided if commanders were encouraged to question assumptions rather than simply execute tradition? The Spartans at Leuctra were individually superior warriors to most of the Thebans they faced, but superior warriors using inferior tactics lost to good warriors using superior tactics. The equation seems obvious in hindsight. It's rarely obvious before the battle. The political aftermath of Leuctra reshaped Greece permanently. Before the battle, Sparta had been the dominant power for generations. Athens was recovering from its defeat in the Peloponnesian War but still weak, and Thebes was a second-tier power. After Leuctra, Sparta was broken, unable to project power beyond its borders, struggling even to defend its homeland. Athens remained important but unable to establish hegemony. Thebes became the strongest land power in Greece, but only while Epaminondas lived. This created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by Macedonia, a kingdom on the periphery of Greek civilization that Greeks had previously dismissed as semi-barbarian. Philip and Alexander's conquests, the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed, the Roman conquest of Greece, all of this flowed in part from the transformation that began at Leuctra. There's also a certain irony in how the tactical lessons of Leuctra were absorbed. Philip of Macedon learned from Theban innovations but combined them with Macedonian cavalry superiority to create a synthesis even more effective than the Theban system. Alexander then used these combined arms tactics to conquer the known world. But the original innovation, the oblique order and concentrated force at the decisive point, came from Epaminondas. He created the tactical revolution that his enemies eventually turned against his own city. Military innovation is democratic in this sense. Once demonstrated, anyone can copy it, improve it, and use it. The advantage goes to the first adopter only until the second adopter learns the lesson and adds to it. Modern military historians debate various aspects of the battle. Exactly how deep was the Theban left wing? Sources say 50 shields deep, but some scholars argue this might be rhetorical exaggeration. How much did terrain influence the battle? The ancient sources focus on tactics and don't describe the ground in detail, but even slight variations in slope or obstacles could have channeled the combat. How decisive was the cavalry skirmish in disrupting Spartan deployment? The sources mention it, but don't elaborate on its impact. These debates will probably never be fully resolved because the ancient sources, while relatively detailed for this battle, don't provide the kind of comprehensive battlefield reports modern historians would prefer. What isn't debatable is the outcome and its significance. Thebes defeated Sparta, the Sacred Band and the Theban left wing, using a revolutionary tactical formation, destroyed the Spartan right wing and killed a Spartan king and hundreds of Spartan citizens. The battle ended Spartan military supremacy and demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome even the most professional and feared military force in the Greek world. These facts are recorded by multiple ancient sources, commemorated in monuments, and analysed by military theorists from antiquity to the present. The psychological impact may have been as important as the tactical lessons. Before Leuctra, Greeks believed Spartans were simply better warriors, that their training and culture produced soldiers who couldn't be beaten in fair combat. After Leuctra, that belief was shattered. Spartans were revealed as mortal, beatable, just men in armour who could be outthought and outfought by commanders who understood modern warfare better than Spartan tradition did. This demystification of Spartan military power changed how every Greek city-state thought about military affairs. You didn't have to be Spartan to have the best army. You just had to think clearly about tactics and train your soldiers effectively. This opened possibilities that the myth of Spartan invincibility had foreclosed. For the Sacred Band specifically, Leuctra was their greatest triumph, and in some ways their defining moment. They had proven that their unconventional structure, pairs of lovers fighting together, produced military effectiveness that exceeded even Spartan training. The ancient sources emphasize that they bore the brunt of the fighting against the Spartan right wing, that they were the spear point of the Theban column that broke through. Their courage under fire, their cohesion under pressure, and their lethality in close combat validated everything Theban military reformers had believed about the power of bonds of affection in warfare. For the next generation, until they made their final stand at Chaeronea, they were the gold standard of heavy infantry, the unit every other Greek city wished they had. The broader lesson about military reform and institutional change resonates beyond ancient Greece. Sparta's decline after Leuctra illustrates what happens when a military power becomes trapped by its own traditions, unable to adapt because adaptation would mean admitting that the old ways aren't optimal. The Spartan system had worked for generations. It had defeated Athens, dominated the Peloponnese, and made Sparta the most feared power in Greece. Why change something that worked? But circumstances had changed. Armies had evolved. Tactical thinking had advanced. And Sparta's refusal or inability to evolve with changing circumstances meant that when they finally faced an innovative enemy, they had no answer. Epaminondas didn't beat the Spartans with better soldiers. He beat them with better ideas. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The French knights at Crécy in 1340 charging into English longbow fire. The British at Isandlwana in 1879 underestimating Zulu tactics. The French in 1940 unprepared for German combined arms warfare. In each case, a professional military force with proud traditions and past victories was defeated by enemies who had thought more creatively about how to fight. The defeated weren't cowards or fools, they were professionals doing what their training and doctrine taught them. But professionalism without adaptability is just experienced incompetence. Leuctra was perhaps the first clear historical example of this principle. The date July 6th, 371 BCE marks a pivot point in Greek history, as significant as Marathon or Salamis. Those earlier battles saved Greece from Persian conquest. Leuctra ended one Greek hegemony and opened the door for another. The Greece that existed before Leuctra, with Sparta dominant and seemingly permanent, was different from the Greece after, with power shifting between Thebes, Athens, and eventually Macedonia. The battle demonstrated that in the Greek world, military supremacy was temporary, that innovation trumped tradition, and that clever tactics could overcome superior numbers and reputation. For Epaminondas personally, Leuctra was his masterpiece but not his finale. He would win other battles, conduct other campaigns, and continue to demonstrate his tactical genius. But nothing surpassed the shock and impact of that first great victory, when he shattered Greek assumptions about warfare and destroyed the myth of Spartan invincibility with one devastating afternoon of concentrated violence at the point of decision. He had promised the Thebans he could break Spartan power. On the plain of Leuctra, with the Sacred Band as his instrument and the oblique order as his method, he kept that promise. The Spartans who survived Leuctra returned home to a city in shock. Their entire identity was built around military supremacy. Now that supremacy was exposed as hollow, they would fight other battles, win some victories, but never again would they dominate Greece. The slow decline from Leuctra to irrelevance took generations, but the trajectory was set on that July day. Some Spartans understood this immediately. Others clung to the belief that Leuctra was an aberration, that Spartan methods remained sound, that the old ways would triumph eventually. They were wrong. The world had moved on, and Sparta was being left behind by forces they couldn't control and wouldn't adapt to. Thebes had its moment of glory. For 9 years, from Leuctra to Mantinea, they were the dominant land power in Greece. But Theban hegemony depended on one man's genius, and when Epaminondas died, the system he built couldn't sustain itself. This too is a lesson of history. Great commanders can transform military affairs, but unless their innovations are institutionalized, taught to successors, and embedded in doctrine, they die with their creators. Philip of Macedon succeeded where Thebes failed because he created a system that could function without him, then left it to a son who was even more brilliant. Epaminondas created innovations but not institutions, and Thebes paid the price. The Sacred Band's final battle at Chaeronea in 338 BCE closes the arc that began at Leuctra. They had broken the Spartans' reputation, fought in numerous battles across Greece, and maintained their elite status for a generation. When they made their last stand against the Macedonian army, they weren't fighting for Theban hegemony anymore. That was already lost. They were fighting for honour, for each other, for the bonds that made them sacred. Philip's reported tears over their bodies suggest that even enemies recognized something extraordinary in these 300 men who chose death over dishonour. They had proven that military effectiveness could be built on love as well as discipline, that unconventional ideas about unit cohesion could produce superior results. Military academies worldwide still teach Leuctra in courses on tactics and military history. The principles demonstrated there: concentration of force, economy of force on non-decisive sectors, attacking the enemy's strength to break their morale, using depth to create unstoppable momentum, these remain relevant. Modern terminology like main effort and supporting effort describes the same concepts Epaminondas put into practice with his oblique order. Tank formations breaking through enemy lines, artillery concentrations at decisive points, naval task forces massing against enemy strongpoints, all echo the same logic demonstrated by the Sacred Band's charge into the Spartan right wing. The human cost of the battle: 400 Spartan citizens dead along with several hundred Theban casualties from units that bore the brunt of fighting, represents lives ended and futures erased in an afternoon of bronze and blood. Each casualty was someone's son, possibly someone's father, part of a community that would mourn his loss. Ancient battles often feel abstract in historical accounts, formations maneuvering and casualties tallied like pieces removed from a game board, but Leuctra was hundreds of men dying violently, crushed in the press of combat, speared through bronze armour, trampled underfoot, bleeding out on dusty ground while the living fought over their bodies. The tactical brilliance that military historians admire was experienced by the participants as terror, pain, and death. Both perspectives are valid, both necessary to understand what 1530 happened. The generations that followed Leuctra absorbed its lessons unevenly. Some commanders understood the principle of concentrated force and used it effectively. Others learned superficial lessons, that deeper formations were better, without understanding why Epaminondas had used depth or when it was appropriate. Military history is full of generals who copied the form of successful tactics without understanding the substance, leading to defeat when they applied copied methods to inappropriate situations. The true genius of Epaminondas wasn't that he used a 50-deep formation. It was that he understood when such a formation would achieve decision, how to protect his weak flank by refusing it, and how to time and direct his attack for maximum psychological and physical impact. These subtleties are harder to copy than formation depth. Looking back across 2,300 years, the Battle of Leuctra stands as proof that in warfare, ideas matter as much as courage or numbers. The Spartans had courage in abundance and were not significantly outnumbered. They lost because Epaminondas had better ideas about how to fight the battle. Military history pivots on such moments when innovation defeats tradition, when someone questions the established way of doing things and discovers a better approach. Leuctra was one of those pivots, a battle that changed how Greeks thought about warfare and whose tactical lessons echoed through Alexander's conquests and beyond into our present day. On a summer morning in Boeotia, Epaminondas and the Sacred Band rewrote military science and ended an era. The Spartans came to Leuctra as the masters of Greek warfare. They left defeated, diminished, and facing a future where their ancient supremacy was nothing but memory. The transformation of Greek warfare that began at Leuctra extended far beyond the immediate battlefield results. In the months following the battle, Epaminondas had to consolidate Theban control over Boeotia and prepare for the inevitable Spartan response. Sparta would not accept such a humiliation without attempting to restore its position. The Ephors in Sparta faced a crisis unlike anything in their history. They had lost a king, 400 citizens, and their reputation in a single afternoon. The question now was whether to sue for peace, accepting diminished status, or to gather their remaining strength for another campaign. Sparta chose to fight on, but the conviction that had animated previous campaigns was gone. Soldiers who had believed themselves invincible now knew they could bleed and die like anyone else. The political maneuvering in the aftermath proved as important as the battle itself. Athens, Sparta's old enemy, watched the shifting power dynamics with deep concern. A Theban hegemony replacing a Spartan one wasn't necessarily an improvement from the Athenian perspective. The Athenians had no desire to see another land power dominating Greece, especially not one as close to Athens as Thebes. This led to one of the stranger diplomatic reversals in Greek history. Athens, which had fought a generation-long war against Sparta ending in humiliating defeat, now began moving toward an accommodation with their old enemy. The enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, even when that enemy had recently been your destroyer. This Athenian-Spartan rapprochement, unthinkable before Leuctra, showed how completely the battle had scrambled Greek political alignments. Epaminondas understood that military victory alone wouldn't secure Theban power. He needed to transform the victory into lasting strategic advantage. This meant not just defeating Sparta in battle, but dismantling the foundations of Spartan power. In the winter of 370 to 369 BCE, he led a Theban army into the Peloponnese for the first time in memory. This invasion wasn't aimed at conquest, it was aimed at liberation. The Helots, Sparta's enslaved population who worked the land and produced the agricultural surplus that allowed Spartan citizens to train for war full-time, were encouraged to revolt. Epaminondas and his Theban forces protected these revolts, preventing Spartan forces from crushing them as they had crushed previous Helot uprisings. The strategic vision was elegant. Without Helot labour, Spartan citizens would have to work their own land. Without time for full-time military training, they couldn't maintain the professional army that was the source of their power. Sparta's military dominance had always rested on economic exploitation. Remove the economic foundation and the military superstructure would collapse. The founding of Messene in 369 BCE represented the most devastating blow Epaminondas delivered to Sparta. Messenia had been conquered by Sparta centuries earlier, its population enslaved as Helots, its agricultural production appropriating to support Spartan citizens. Now Epaminondas helped the Messenians establish a fortified city, provided military support, and recognized Messene as an independent state. The psychological impact on Sparta was crushing. Messenia had been Spartan territory for over 300 years. Generations of Spartans had grown up considering Messenian Helots as natural resources, like water or timber, things that simply existed for Spartan benefit. Now those Helots were citizens of their own state, behind walls that Sparta lacked the military strength to assault. The loss of Messenian agricultural production cut Spartan economic capacity by perhaps 40%. This single strategic move, made possible by the victory at Leuctra, ensured that Sparta could never return to its former power, even if it rebuilt its army. Megalopolis, another city founded with Theban support during this period, completed the encirclement of Sparta's strategic position. Located in Arcadia, north of Sparta, Megalopolis was created by Sinoicism, the merging of multiple small villages into a single fortified city. This new city served as a check on Spartan expansion northward, and as a rallying point for Arcadian cities that wanted protection from Spartan aggression. Between Messene to the west and Megalopolis to the north, Sparta was hemmed in, unable to expand, unable to restore its agricultural base, declining toward irrelevance. These were the strategic fruits of tactical victory. Epaminondas understood that battles win glory, but strategy wins wars. He had won the battle at Leuctra. Now he was winning the war by making Sparta's recovery impossible. The response from Sparta's remaining allies was telling. Cities that had loyally followed Sparta for generations began reconsidering their positions. The Peloponnesian League, which had been the instrument of Spartan hegemony, started fragmenting. Some cities sided with Thebes, others tried to remain neutral. A few stuck with Sparta out of traditional loyalty or fear of Theban domination replacing Spartan domination. But the automatic obedience that Sparta had commanded before Leuctra was gone. Greek cities now calculated whether following Sparta served their interests rather than simply assuming that Sparta's power made obedience necessary. This was a fundamental shift in Greek interstate politics. Power based purely on military reputation requires constant validation through victory. Once the reputation is punctured by defeat, the power evaporates quickly. Sparta was learning this harsh lesson. Within Thebes itself, Leuctra's victory created both opportunities and dangers. Epaminondas had proven his genius, but success bred jealousy and political opposition. Ancient sources describe multiple occasions when Epaminondas faced prosecution in Theban courts for various alleged offences, including exceeding his command authority by remaining in Boeotia longer than authorised after Leuctra to secure the victory. These prosecutions were probably driven by political rivals who resented his prominence and feared he might establish himself as a tyrant. Epaminondas defended himself with the same eloquence he displayed in military planning, and the people consistently acquitted him. But the need to constantly defend himself in court while simultaneously conducting military operations showed the weakness of Theban political institutions. The city's power depended almost entirely on one man's abilities, and internal political squabbling threatened to waste the advantages that man had won. The training and preparation that made Leuctra possible also deserves examination. The Sacred Band wasn't created immediately before the battle. It had been established around 378 BCE, nearly 7 years before Leuctra. During those years, these 300 men trained constantly, practiced coordinated maneuvers, built the trust and understanding that pairs of lovers developed over time. Ancient sources describe the Sacred Band training at the Theban gymnasium, exercising together, eating together, living together. This constant association built unit cohesion that couldn't be replicated in formations that assembled only during campaigns. When modern military forces emphasize unit cohesion and train together for extended periods before deployment, they're following principles the Sacred Band exemplified. The bond between soldiers who trust each other absolutely, who know each other's capabilities intimately, who care about each other beyond military discipline, creates combat effectiveness that exceeds what individual skill alone can produce. The broader Theban army also underwent significant reforms in the years leading to Leuctra. Pelopidas and Epaminondas, the two leaders most responsible for Theban military revival, emphasized training and discipline throughout the Boeotian forces. They studied Spartan training methods and adapted what worked while rejecting what didn't. Unlike Sparta's system, which took boys from their families at age 7 and subjected them to brutal conditioning designed to produce obedient warriors, the Theban system trained citizens who retained their individual judgment while learning collective discipline. This produced soldiers who could think on the battlefield, adapt to changing circumstances, and follow complex tactical plans. The oblique order at Leuctra required that the refused right wing hold its position, rather than charging forward, that the left wing maintain cohesion during its deep advance, that the Sacred Band at the tip of the spear maintained formation under incredible pressure. Poorly trained troops couldn't have executed these requirements. The victory at Leuctra represented years of preparation and institutional reform, not just one man's tactical genius on the day. The economic dimensions of the post-Leuctra period also shaped events significantly. Warfare in ancient Greece was expensive. Hoplites provided their own armour and weapons, but the state had to feed armies in the field, pay for logistics, and compensate citizens for time spent on campaign rather than working. Athens had financed the Peloponnesian War partly through its silver mines at Laurium and the tribute from its empire. Sparta had relied on Helot agricultural production and contributions from allies. Thebes had neither silver mines nor an empire, but it controlled rich agricultural land in Boeotia and could demand contributions from the Boeotian League cities. The question was whether Theban finances could sustain the extended campaigns necessary to consolidate victory. Epaminondas' invasions of the Peloponnese were logistically challenging, requiring the Theban army to march hundreds of miles from home, maintain supply lines, and operate in potentially hostile territory. That he succeeded in these campaigns, founding cities and supporting rebellions while keeping his army fed and equipped, demonstrated administrative abilities that matched his tactical skills. The technological aspects of the battle, the weapons and armour used by both sides, remained relatively consistent with standard Greek practice of the period. Hoplites wore bronze cuirasses protecting the torso, bronze greaves on their shins, and bronze helmets, typically Corinthian or Chalcidian style. They carried large round shields, roughly 3 feet in diameter, faced with bronze. Their primary weapon was the dory, a spear 7 to 9 feet long, with an iron point and a bronze butt spike. For close combat if the spear broke, they had short swords, either the curved kopis or straight xiphos. This equipment had been standard for generations. What changed at Leuctra wasn't the weapons, but how they were employed. The Sacred Band carried the same spears as Spartan hoplites, but their deeper formation, better coordination, and the psychological advantage of fighting alongside their lovers made them more effective with those same weapons. Technology matters in warfare, but tactics, training, and morale often matter more. The Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, 9 years after Leuctra, showed both the continued brilliance of Epaminondas and the fragility of Theban power. Once again facing a coalition that included Sparta and Athens, Epaminondas used tactical variations on the oblique order to win another victory. He strengthened his cavalry, placed them on the left wing alongside the Sacred Band and the deep Theban phalanx, and struck the allied right wing with combined arms coordination that anticipated Philip and Alexander's later tactics. The Thebans broke through, routed the opposition, and won the battle. But in the moment of victory, Epaminondas was struck by a spear that pierced his chest. The wound was mortal. Ancient sources describe him remaining conscious long enough to ensure that Thebes had won, to designate his successors, and to accept that he died without sons to carry on his name. His last words, according to tradition, were that his monuments were the victories at Leuctra and Mantinea. Then he pulled the spear from his chest and died. With him died Theban hegemony. His successors, competent but not brilliant, couldn't maintain the dominance he had established. Within a generation, Thebes would face Philip of Macedon and discover that the Macedonian king had learned all of Epaminondas' lessons and added cavalry power and siege engineering that Thebes couldn't match. The irony of military innovation is that success teaches your enemies. Every effective tactic is eventually copied, countered, or surpassed. The oblique order worked brilliantly at Leuctra because Sparta wasn't prepared for it. By Mantinea, commanders understood the principle and deployed accordingly. Philip of Macedon watched Theban tactics, possibly as a hostage in Thebes after Leuctra, and synthesized them with Macedonian cavalry traditions to create something even more effective. Alexander then perfected his father's system and conquered the known world. The tactical revolution Epaminondas began didn't end with Theban dominance. It transformed Greek and Macedonian warfare permanently, but the benefits accrued to whoever learned the lessons best and adapted them most effectively. Thebes had the first mover advantage but couldn't sustain it institutionally. Macedonia sustained it and built an empire. The cultural impact of Leuctra extended beyond military tactics into Greek thought about warfare and society. The Sacred Band's effectiveness challenged conventional thinking about military organization. If pairs of lovers fought better than traditionally organized units, what did that say about the relationships that produced military effectiveness? Greek philosophers and historians debated these questions. Plato discussed the concept in his Symposium. Though written before Leuctra, it addressed similar ideas about how erotic bonds could motivate courage. Xenophon, the historian and military theorist, had to grapple with the fact that Sparta, whose system he admired, had been defeated by Theban innovations he had to acknowledge even if he didn't like them. The intellectual ferment in Greece during this period, the questioning of established truths, the willingness to experiment with new ideas, created an environment where military innovation was possible. Epaminondas was a product of that environment, a philosopher general who applied rational thought to military problems rather than simply following tradition. The religious dimensions of Greek warfare also played a role at Leuctra. Both sides consulted oracles before the battle. The Spartans received ambiguous omens. Ancient sources report various portents that Spartan priests interpreted favourably, but which in hindsight could be read as warnings. The Thebans also received prophecies, some encouraging, some ominous. Epaminondas, rationalist though he was, understood the psychological importance of divine favour. Soldiers fight better when they believe the gods support them. Whether Epaminondas personally believed in the literal truth of oracles is unknowable, but he certainly understood their utility in maintaining morale. After the victory, sacrifices and dedications to the gods were made, monuments erected, and the favour of the divine acknowledged. This religious aspect of Greek warfare, easy for modern readers to dismiss as superstition, was deadly serious for the participants. They believed that divine favour influenced outcomes, that piety and impiety had tangible consequences, and that victories were gifts from the gods as much as results of human effort. The commemoration of Leuctra in ancient sources provides insight into how Greeks remembered and interpreted the battle. Xenophon, contemporary historian and Sparta sympathizer, covered the battle but minimized Theban achievement, focusing instead on Spartan misfortune. Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, provided more detail and credited Epaminondas's genius explicitly. Plutarch wrote biographies of both Epaminondas and Pelopidas, preserving stories and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Pausanias, the travel writer, described monuments and the battlefield itself. These varied sources don't always agree on details, different numbers for troop strengths, variations in exactly how the battle unfolded, contradictory claims about specific events. But they agree on the essentials. Thebes defeated Sparta. Epaminondas used innovative tactics. The Sacred Band fought brilliantly. The battle transformed Greek power relationships. Modern historians sift through these sources, comparing accounts, checking archaeological evidence where it exists, trying to reconstruct what actually happened. The story of Leuctra that emerges is necessarily a reconstruction, the most plausible narrative given imperfect evidence, but the magnitude of the battle and its consequences aren't in doubt. The question of why Sparta didn't adapt after Leuctra is psychologically fascinating. They had been shown definitively that their methods were obsolete. They had lost battles, lost manpower, lost territory. The rational response would be comprehensive military reform, adopting Theban innovations, developing new tactics, rebuilding their system from the ground up. Instead, Sparta clung to tradition. They continued training soldiers the same way, fighting the same way, believing that the problem was execution rather than doctrine. This rigidity, cultural inability to admit that fundamental change was necessary, accelerated Spartan decline. By the time Sparta faced Macedonia in the late 4th century, they were completely unable to compete. Their army was small, their tactics antiquated, their strategic position hopeless. The destruction of Sparta as a significant power took decades, but the trajectory was set at Leuctra when innovation defeated tradition, and the defenders of tradition refused to learn from defeat. The geographic knowledge that Epaminondas demonstrated in his campaigns also deserves note. Ancient commanders didn't have detailed maps or satellite imagery. Geographic knowledge came from personal observation, reports from travellers and merchants, and accumulated cultural knowledge. Epaminondas's invasions of the Peloponnese required intimate understanding of terrain, road networks, water sources, and potential defensive positions. He had to move thousands of men hundreds of miles, keep them supplied, avoid ambush, and operate in territory where the population might be hostile. That he succeeded in founding cities and supporting revolts while maintaining his army's combat effectiveness showed mastery of logistics and strategy that went far beyond tactical brilliance in set-piece battles. Great generals throughout history share this combination of tactical skill and logistical competence. It's not enough to know how to win battles. You have to get your army to the battlefield in condition to fight, keep it supplied during operations, and manage the administrative details that make sustained campaigns possible. The social structure within the Theban army reflected broader Boeotian society. Unlike Sparta's rigid caste system with citizens, peroikoi, and helots, or Athens' democracy with its own class distinctions, Theban society was oligarchic but relatively fluid. Wealthy citizens held political power, but merit could elevate individuals regardless of birth. This social mobility created an army where promotion based on ability was possible, where talented officers could rise to command, and where innovation was rewarded rather than punished. Epaminondas himself came from an old but not particularly wealthy family. His prominence was based on proven ability rather than inherited status. This meritocratic element in Theban military culture contributed to their success. The best commanders led regardless of aristocratic pedigree. The best tactics were adopted regardless of who proposed them. This openness to merit and innovation contrasted with Sparta's rigid adherence to traditional methods and helps explain why Thebes could innovate while Sparta couldn't. The psychological warfare aspects of Leuctra and its aftermath also merit consideration. The Spartans had cultivated an image of invincibility for generations. Their armour, their crimson cloaks, their lambda shields, the legends about Thermopylae and countless other battles all created psychological intimidation that gave them an advantage before fighting even began. Enemies facing Spartans often doubted themselves, wondered if resistance was futile, questioned whether courage alone could overcome Spartan discipline. This psychological edge was as important as their actual military capabilities. Leuctra shattered that psychological advantage completely. After Leuctra, enemies facing Spartans thought not about Spartan invincibility, but about Spartan vulnerability, about 400 dead citizens, about a broken right wing retreating in disorder. Psychological intimidation works until it doesn't, and once shattered, it's almost impossible to restore. Sparta's psychological dominance built over centuries died in an afternoon at Leuctra. No amount of subsequent victories, and there were some, could fully restore it. The role of individual leadership in determining historical outcomes appears clearly in the Leuctra story. Without Epaminondas, would Thebes have defeated Sparta? Possibly eventually, but likely not at that moment in that way with such decisive effect. One man's genius, his ability to see past established doctrine, his courage to implement radical tactics, his skill in executing complex maneuvers, determined the outcome of the battle. This raises questions about historical determinism versus individual agency. Are historical outcomes determined by broad social forces, economic conditions, technological development, making individuals merely instruments of inevitable change? Or do exceptional individuals genuinely shape history, creating outcomes that wouldn't have occurred without their specific contributions? Leuctra suggests that individuals matter enormously. The tactical innovations were Epaminondas' ideas. The execution required his leadership. The strategic exploitation of victory depended on his vision. Remove him from the equation, and the entire sequence of events might have unfolded differently. History is made by forces larger than individuals, but individuals of exceptional ability can channel and direct those forces in ways that transform outcomes. The parallel between Leuctra and other battles where tactical innovation defeated established military powers invites comparison. Cannae, where Hannibal used double envelopment to destroy a larger Roman army. Agincourt, where English longbows massacred French knights. Breitenfeld, where Gustavus Adolphus's mobile artillery and disciplined infantry defeated the Spanish tercio. Blitzkrieg tactics in 1940 overwhelming French and British forces unprepared for combined arms mobile warfare. In each case, innovation defeated tradition, creative thinking overcame established doctrine, and professional armies found their methods obsolete. The common pattern is that established military powers, successful for generations, become psychologically invested in the methods that brought them success. They can't imagine that those methods might become obsolete. They train to perfect established doctrine rather than questioning whether the doctrine remains valid. When they encounter an innovative enemy who has thought more deeply about how warfare has changed, they lose catastrophically. The defeated forces weren't incompetent, they were competent at fighting the previous war. Leuctra was perhaps the first clear historical example of this pattern, but it certainly wasn't the last. The influence of Leuctra on subsequent Greek military thought appears in the works of later writers and in the practice of Hellenistic armies. The tactical manual attributed to Aeneas Tacticus, written shortly after this period, shows awareness of oblique order tactics. Later Hellenistic commanders used variations on concentration of force principles. The Romans, conquering Greece in the 2nd century BCE, faced phalanxes that had learned from Theban innovations even though Thebes itself was long gone as a military power. Military knowledge accumulates across generations. Leuctra contributed tactical concepts that became part of the standard repertoire of Greek and Macedonian warfare. Even after Thebes faded, even after the specific circumstances that made Leuctra possible passed into history, the lessons remained. This is how military thought evolves. Innovations proven in battle become doctrine. That doctrine gets taught to new generations. Those generations apply the lessons in new contexts, creating further innovations. The cycle continues, building on past success while adapting to present circumstances. The end of the story, if stories like this have ends, came in 335 BCE when Alexander the Great destroyed Thebes. The city had rebelled against Macedonian hegemony, believing Alexander was dead and that Macedonian power could be overthrown. They were wrong. Alexander marched on Thebes with devastating speed, besieged the city, and when his Macedonian and Greek allies poured through the breaches, he allowed them to sack it completely. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was razed except for the house of the poet Pindar and the temples. Theban power, which had risen after Leuctra to brief hegemony, ended in massacre and slavery. The Sacred Band had already been destroyed at Chaeronea 3 years earlier. Now the city they defended was annihilated. It was brutal finality, but it also represented a kind of historical closure. Thebes had defeated Sparta using innovative tactics. Macedonia had learned those tactics, improved on them, and used superior organization and resources to dominate all of Greece. The cycle of military innovation and adaptation had moved past Thebes. The city that had been the most important military power in Greece for a brief period in the 360s, BCE was now irrelevant, its population scattered, its walls demolished, its moment of glory preserved only in historical memory. Yet the memory of Leuctra and what it represented lived on. Roman military theorists studied the battle. Medieval and Renaissance writers on warfare referenced it. Modern military academies teach it still. The tactical principles demonstrated there remain valid in contexts Epaminondas could never have imagined. Armoured divisions concentrating at decisive points, while fixing the enemy elsewhere with secondary efforts. Naval task forces massing to achieve local superiority. Even modern maneuver warfare with its emphasis on speed, concentration, and striking the enemy's critical vulnerabilities rather than his strengths, echoes the same logic that Epaminondas applied with the Sacred Band and the Theban left wing. The specifics change with technology and scale, but the principles endure because they're rooted in fundamental truths about combat. Concentrate your strength against critical enemy weaknesses. Avoid fighting where the enemy is strongest unless you can bring overwhelming force. Use deception and surprise to shape the battle before it begins. These lessons, written in Spartan and Theban blood on the plain of Leuctra in 371 BCE, remain as relevant today as they were then. That's why military officers separated from the battle by 2,300 years, and countless technological revolutions still study what happened when Epaminondas and the Sacred Band shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility, and proved that in warfare ideas can matter as much as courage and steel. Escript 7, 1274 BCE. The sun rose over the Orontes River Valley in what is now modern Syria, illuminating one of the largest military concentrations the ancient world had ever seen. Pharaoh Rameses II, 25 years old and burning with ambition, led approximately 20,000 Egyptian soldiers north toward the fortified city of Kadesh. Across the river, hidden behind the city's massive walls, Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites, commanded a force that may have numbered 40,000 men, supported by perhaps 3,500 chariots from allied kingdoms, stretching across Anatolia and Syria. What was about to unfold would become one of the most documented battles of the ancient world, recorded in hieroglyphics on temple walls across Egypt, in cuneiform on Hittite tablets, and debated by scholars for over 3 millennia. The strategic importance of Kadesh cannot be overstated. This city controlled the crucial trade routes between Egypt's sphere of influence in Canaan and the Hittite Empire's territories in Anatolia. For decades, the two superpowers had maneuvered for control of the Levant, with smaller kingdoms forced to choose sides or face annihilation. The previous pharaoh, Seti I, Ramesses' father, had campaigned in the region but failed to secure lasting control. Now his son, eager to prove himself and establish his own legacy, marched north with Egypt's most formidable military force in generations. The Egyptian army was organized into 4 divisions, each named after a major deity and numbering approximately 5,000 men. The division of Amun, led personally by Ramesses, marched at the front. Behind them came the division of Re, then Ptah, and finally Seth bringing up the rear. This spacing, with significant distances between divisions, was standard Egyptian military procedure, designed to prevent the entire army from being caught in a single ambush and to allow for flexible deployment once the enemy was located. Each division contained a mix of infantry, armed with spears, swords, and shields. Archers with composite bows and the pride of Egypt's military, the chariot corps. Egyptian chariots were marvels of Bronze Age engineering. Constructed primarily from bent wood, with leather bindings and bronze fittings, each chariot weighed perhaps 75 pounds, light enough to be carried by 2 men but strong enough to withstand the rigours of battle. The wheels, typically with 6 spokes, were positioned at the rear of the platform to maximise speed and manoeuvrability. Each chariot carried 2 men, a driver who controlled the 2 horses and a warrior, typically an archer, who would fire arrows while the chariot was in motion. The composite bows used by Egyptian chariot archers were powerful weapons, capable of penetrating armour at 100 yards, and each archer carried a quiver holding perhaps 30 to 40 arrows. The Hittite military machine was equally impressive but fundamentally different in design and doctrine. Hittite chariots were heavier, built for shock combat rather than mobile archery. They carried 3 men, a driver, a warrior with a spear or sword, and a shield-bearer who protected both. This configuration made them less manoeuvrable than Egyptian chariots, but devastating in close combat. The extra weight and 3rd crew member transformed the Hittite chariot into a battering ram that could crash through infantry formations. Hittite infantry were organised into tight formations, armed with spears and large shields, trained to present a wall of bronze-tipped spears to any attacker. As Rameses and the division of Amun approached Kadesh on what we believe was the 5th day of the 3rd month of summer, they encountered 2 Bedouin tribesmen who claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. These men, brought before Pharaoh, told an encouraging story. Muwatalli and his army, they said, were far to the north near Aleppo, too frightened to face Egypt's might to give battle. This intelligence seemed plausible. The Hittites had avoided major confrontations in previous campaigns. Rameses, eager to secure Kadesh before his full army assembled, ordered the division of Amun to increase their pace. What Rameses didn't know, what those Bedouin spies sent by Muwatalli had successfully concealed, was that the entire Hittite army was hidden on the far side of Kadesh itself, screened by the city's walls and the terrain of the river valley. Muwatalli had executed a brilliant deception, feeding false intelligence to Egyptian scouts and using the fortress city as cover for the largest chariot force ever assembled in the ancient world. While Rameses made camp northwest of Kadesh, with only the division of Amun, the other 3 divisions strung out for miles along the approach route, the Hittite king prepared to spring his trap. The Egyptian camp that afternoon was a scene of controlled chaos. Soldiers erected tents, tended to horses, prepared meals, and attended to the 1,000 details required to maintain an army in the field. Rameses occupied the centre of the camp in his royal pavilion, surrounded by his household troops and advisors. The chariots were unhitched, horses watered and fed, weapons stacked. The division of Array was approaching, but still perhaps an hour's march away. The divisions of Tar and Seth were even farther behind, following the road through the forest of Labwi south of Kadesh. Then Egyptian scouts captured 2 Hittite soldiers. Under interrogation, likely involving torture as was standard practice in the ancient world, these men revealed the truth. The Hittite army wasn't near Aleppo. It was here, behind Kadesh, preparing to attack. The interrogation report, preserved in the hieroglyphic accounts, records Rameses' fury at his intelligence failure. He immediately summoned his generals and ordered messengers sent to hurry forward the division of Re, and warn the other divisions of the impending attack. But it was too late. Even as Egyptian officers scrambled to organize a defense, Muwatalli launched his assault. The Hittite plan was elegant in its simplicity. A massive chariot force, perhaps 2,500 vehicles carrying 7,500 men, would cross the Orontes at a ford south of the Egyptian camp, hidden from view by terrain and vegetation. They would then sweep north, striking the approaching division of Re in the flank as it marched toward the camp. Once Re was destroyed or scattered, the chariots would continue north to overwhelm Rameses and the division of Amun before the other Egyptian divisions could intervene. The division of Re, marching in column formation with their chariots interspersed among the infantry, never had a chance. The Hittite chariot charge hit them like a bronze-tipped avalanche. Imagine 2,500 chariots, each pulled by 2 horses, the thunder of 5,000 hooves shaking the ground, the vehicles racing in a wedge formation designed to penetrate and shatter enemy lines. The Egyptian infantry, caught in marching order rather than battle formation, broke almost immediately. Men scattered in every direction, some trying to form defensive positions, most simply running for their lives. The Egyptian chariots attempted to deploy, drivers frantically hitching horses while archers strung bows, but the Hittite charge was too fast, too overwhelming. Hittite three-man chariots crashed into Egyptian positions with devastating effect. The shield-bearer protected the crew while the warrior thrust with spear or slashed with sword, the extra man and heavier construction, allowing them to literally run down enemy soldiers. Egyptian accounts describe the division of Re as destroyed, its soldiers scattered, its chariots captured or smashed. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the initial attack, essentially eliminating Re as an effective fighting force in a matter of minutes. The Hittite chariots, their blood up, their initial attack successful beyond any reasonable expectation, continued north toward Ramesses' camp. The Egyptian scouts and the fleeing survivors of Re provided perhaps 10 to 15 minutes of warning. It wasn't enough. The division of Amun was scattered throughout the camp, relaxed, unprepared for battle. Ramesses, according to his own accounts inscribed on temple walls across Egypt, raged at his generals for the intelligence failure and the army's unreadiness. But rage wouldn't stop 2,500 chariots. The Hittite charge hit the western side of the Egyptian camp like a battering ram striking a mud brick wall. The camp's hastily erected palisades, designed more to mark boundaries and keep livestock contained than to repel a military assault, offered minimal resistance. Hittite chariots burst through and into the camp interior, their crews killing anyone who offered resistance. Egyptian soldiers, caught completely unprepared, died by the hundreds. Some fought back with whatever weapons came to hand. Most ran. The camp dissolved into chaos, smoke from cooking fires mixing with dust raised by thousands of hooves and wheels, the air filled with the screams of dying men and horses, the crash of bronze on bronze, the splintering of wood. Ramesses, by his own account, found himself surrounded by Hittite chariots with his household guard dying around him. The pharaoh's personal chariot was hitched, and with his shield-bearer and driver, he prepared to die fighting. This is where Egyptian accounts and Hittite records diverge dramatically, revealing how ancient propaganda shaped historical narratives. According to the elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions Ramesses commissioned, he single-handedly turned the tide of battle, his divine favour from Amun, allowing him to kill hundreds of Hittites, rally his scattered troops, and ultimately defeat the enemy. The poem of Pentor, one of the primary Egyptian sources, describes Ramesses as fighting like the god Set, shooting arrows that never missed, driving his chariot through enemy ranks like a whirlwind. The reality, pieced together from Hittite records and careful analysis of the Egyptian accounts themselves, was more complex and more interesting. Ramesses did fight bravely. This seems clear from all sources. Egyptian pharaohs were trained as warriors from childhood, expected to lead from the front, and Ramesses at 25 was in his physical prime. His personal courage likely did inspire some of his household troops to make a stand rather than flee. But one man, even a pharaoh, couldn't turn back 2,500 chariots. What saved Ramesses, and what the Egyptian accounts mention almost as an afterthought, was the arrival of the Nearin, a force of elite troops that Ramesses had dispatched on a separate route along the coast. These soldiers, perhaps 2,000 strong, arrived at the critical moment, falling on the Hittite chariots from an unexpected direction. More importantly, and this the Egyptian accounts barely mention, the Hittite chariot crews had made a fatal mistake. Victorious, surrounded by the wealth of the Egyptian camp, they had stopped to plunder. This is one of the eternal problems of ancient warfare. Soldiers, poorly paid if paid at all, saw battles as opportunities for loot. The Egyptian camp contained the wealth of a pharaoh: gold, silver, fine weapons, elaborate tents, food, wine, and treasure beyond imagination for common soldiers. Hittite chariot crews, their initial objectives achieved, their enemies scattered, began looting instead of pressing their attack. The tight formations that had made their charge so devastating dissolved as individual crews sought plunder. When the Nearin struck, they hit a dispersed, distracted enemy. The Hittite chariots, scattered throughout the camp, couldn't reform their wedge formations in the confined space. Individual vehicles became targets, their crews fighting alone rather than as part of a coordinated mass. Egyptian accounts describe the Nearin attack as devastating, killing hundreds of Hittites and driving the rest back across the camp's remains toward the Orontes. Simultaneously, the remnants of the division of Amun, rallied by their officers and inspired by seeing Pharaoh still alive and fighting, began to reform. Egyptian chariots that had managed to deploy during the battle now counterattacked. The momentum shifted. Hittite crews, realizing they were now the ones surrounded, abandoned their plunder and fled. The Egyptian accounts claim massive Hittite casualties during this phase, bodies piled so high that chariots drove over corpses, men drowning in the Orontes as they tried to escape. Mu'atali, commanding from across the river, could see his victory dissolving into disaster. He had destroyed one Egyptian division and badly mauled another, but Rameses still lived. The Egyptian camp, though damaged, remained in Egyptian hands, and now the divisions of Ptah and Seth were approaching. The Hittite king made a crucial decision. He ordered a second attack, this time using fresh chariot forces that had been held in reserve and supported by infantry. This attack came from the east, directly from Kadesh, attempting to finish what the first assault had started. But now the Egyptians were ready. The division of Amun, bloodied but not broken, had formed a defensive line. The Nearin held the camp's western approaches. Most critically, elements of the division of Ptah were arriving, adding fresh troops to the Egyptian side. The second Hittite attack, launched in the late afternoon with the sun beginning to lower, hit prepared defences rather than a surprised camp. The fighting that followed was desperate and brutal. Hittite three-man chariots crashed into Egyptian lines, while infantry pressed forward with spears and shields. Egyptian two-man chariots, more manoeuvrable, darted in and out of combat, archers shooting at point-blank range before wheeling away. The battle became a grinding match of attrition, formations pressing against each other, men dying by the dozens with every passing minute. Neither side could gain decisive advantage. The Hittites had more men, but the Egyptians held defensive positions, and more of their army was arriving with each passing hour. As darkness approached, both commanders faced difficult decisions. Rameses had survived, but his army was badly damaged. The division of Re was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The division of Amun had suffered heavy casualties. Only the late-arriving Ptah and Seth divisions remained relatively intact. But he held the field, held his camp, and most importantly, he was alive. For a pharaoh, survival was victory. The gods had clearly favoured him. Mu'atali had achieved a stunning tactical success, destroying or routing 2 Egyptian divisions, but he had failed to kill or capture Rameses. The Egyptian army, though badly hurt, remained a cohesive force that would be at full strength by morning. More problematic, the Hittite chariot force had suffered significant casualties, probably numbering in the hundreds of vehicles destroyed and perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 men killed or wounded. These were elite troops, expensive to train and equip, not easily replaced. As night fell, the battle ended by mutual exhaustion. The Egyptians held their battered camp. The Hittites withdrew behind Kadesh's walls. Both sides spent the night tending wounded, burning the dead according to their customs, and preparing for what they assumed would be a resumption of battle at dawn. The Egyptian army, now consolidated with all 4 divisions present, outnumbered the Hittite garrison but lacked siege equipment to assault Kadesh's massive fortifications. The Hittites held a nearly impregnable fortress, but had lost the initiative and couldn't drive the Egyptians from the field. What happened next reveals as much about Bronze Age diplomacy as Bronze Age warfare. Rather than fight to mutual destruction, the 2 kings negotiated. The exact terms of their immediate agreement aren't recorded, but the broad outlines are clear. Rameses withdrew south, abandoning any immediate designs on Kadesh, but claiming victory based on his survival and the heavy Hittite casualties. Mu'atali held Kadesh and the region, but had failed to destroy the Egyptian army or kill its pharaoh. Both sides claimed total victory. Rameses returned to Egypt and immediately commissioned the most extensive propaganda campaign in ancient history. The Battle of Kadesh was inscribed on temple walls across Egypt in elaborate hieroglyphic texts and dramatic relief carvings. The poem of Pentor and the prose Record of Kadesh, both composed by Egyptian scribes, describe Rameses as single-handedly defeating the entire Hittite army through a combination of personal valour and divine intervention. These accounts mention the disaster that befell the division of Re, only to emphasise how Rameses overcame even this setback. They describe thousands of Hittite casualties while minimising Egyptian losses. Modern visitors to Luxor, Karnak, Abydos, Abu Simbel, and half a dozen other Egyptian temples can still see these inscriptions, among the longest texts surviving from ancient Egypt. They are masterpieces of propaganda, turning a near disaster into triumphant victory through sheer repetition and artistic genius. The reliefs show Rameses as a giant among men, his chariot trampling Hittite soldiers, his arrows finding their marks with divine accuracy, his enemies fleeing in terror before his might. The Hittite records preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered at their capital, Hattusa in modern Turkey, tell a different story. They describe a great victory over Egypt, the destruction of Egyptian divisions, the routing of Pharaoh's army. Some texts claim Rameses barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield in shame. Neither account is fully accurate and neither is completely false. The truth, as best as historians can reconstruct it, lies somewhere between these competing narratives. The Battle of Kadesh was a tactical victory for the Hittites. They had executed a brilliant ambush, destroyed or routed 2 Egyptian divisions, inflicted heavy casualties, and demonstrated the superiority of their heavy chariot tactics. But it was a strategic failure. They didn't eliminate the Egyptian threat, didn't kill or capture Rameses, and couldn't prevent the Egyptian army from withdrawing intact. The battle resolved nothing. For the next 15 years, Egypt and the Hittite Empire continued their struggle for control of the Levant. Border cities changed hands repeatedly. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. The costs in blood and treasure mounted year after year. Finally, in 1259 or 1258 BCE, the 2 empires negotiated what may be the earliest surviving peace treaty in history. The Treaty of Kadesh, preserved in both hieroglyphic and cuneiform versions, established peace and alliance between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. It defined borders, established mutual defense pacts against other enemies, and even included extradition clauses for fugitives. Rameses married at least 2 Hittite princesses to seal the alliance. The treaty held for the rest of Rameses' long reign and beyond, providing the stability that allowed both empires to focus on other threats. The military lessons of Kadesh reverberated through ancient military thought. The battle demonstrated the vulnerability of armies in transit, the importance of reliable intelligence, and the danger of overconfidence. It showed that tactical victory didn't guarantee strategic success. Most importantly, it revealed the limitations of Bronze Age warfare. Even the most successful ambush couldn't destroy a well-led army, and even the most devastating defeat didn't necessarily end a war. The chariot tactics displayed at Kadesh represented the culmination of centuries of development. The 2-man Egyptian design prioritized mobility and archery, allowing chariot forces to harass enemies from range, to pursue fleeing opponents, and to redeploy rapidly across the battlefield. The 3-man Hittite design sacrificed some mobility for shock power, turning chariots into battering rams that could smash through enemy formations. Both approaches had merit, both achieved results. The battle demonstrated that doctrine and training mattered as much as equipment. The infantry at Kadesh, often overshadowed in accounts by the more glamorous chariot forces, played crucial roles. Egyptian infantry armed with spears, swords, and shields provided the stable defensive line that ultimately halted the Hittite attacks. Hittite infantry, supporting the chariot charges, pressed Egyptian positions and prevented them from counterattacking effectively. The coordination between chariots and infantry, mobile striking power and holding force, became standard doctrine for ancient armies. The logistics of Kadesh were staggering. Rameses' army of 20,000 men required perhaps 2,000 tons of food per month, plus water, fodder for thousands of horses, spare weapons, repair materials, and medical supplies. This supply train stretched for miles, vulnerable to attack, requiring constant protection. The Hittite army, even larger, faced similar challenges. Moving these massive forces through Bronze Age infrastructure, across rivers and through territories that might be hostile, required planning and organization that rivaled the battle itself. The role of individual commanders cannot be overstated. Rameses' personal courage during the crisis probably saved the Egyptian army from complete destruction. His willingness to fight when fleeing might have been safer inspired his household troops to stand, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Muwatalli's ambush plan was brilliant, his intelligence operation successful, his timing nearly perfect. but his decision to hold back reserves for a second attack rather than committing everything to the first charge may have cost him complete victory. The propaganda war that followed Kadesh was in some ways more important than the battle itself. Ramesses' elaborate inscriptions established the template for royal military propaganda that would be copied by rulers for millennia, turn defeat into victory through careful emphasis and omission, highlight personal valor while downplaying setbacks, claim divine favor to explain survival. The poem of Pentor, with its dramatic descriptions of Ramesses fighting alone against thousands, became one of the most widely copied texts in ancient Egypt, ensuring that Ramesses' version of events dominated historical memory for 3,000 years. Modern archaeology has added fascinating details to the story. Analysis of chariot remains from roughly this period shows the sophistication of Bronze Age engineering. The wood was carefully selected and shaped, the joints precisely fitted, the wheels balanced with techniques that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The composite bows used by chariot archers were marvels of material science, combining wood, horn, and sinew in precise ratios to create weapons with draw weights exceeding 100 pounds and effective ranges over 200 yards. The training required to use these weapons from a moving chariot was extensive. Egyptian texts describe chariot warriors training from childhood, learning to shoot while the vehicle was in motion, to judge range and deflection instinctively, to coordinate with their drivers without verbal communication. The horses themselves underwent years of training, learning to charge toward enemy lines despite their natural flight instincts, to respond to subtle rein commands, to maintain formation even when adjacent teams fell. The wounds that ancient warfare inflicted were horrific. Bronze weapons created tearing injuries rather than the clean cuts of steel, arrows lodged in bone, requiring painful extraction. Spear thrusts penetrated organs, causing slow death from internal bleeding. The medical care available was primitive by modern standards, though Egyptian physicians had sophisticated knowledge of wound treatment including stitching, cauterization, and the use of honey as an antibacterial agent. Still, infection killed many who survived initial wounds, and scarring from injuries marked veterans for life. The psychological impact of combat at Kadesh must have been immense. Soldiers faced death from arrows fired from hundreds of yards away by enemies they couldn't see clearly. They fought in tight formations where the man next to them might be killed instantly, blood and worse spattering across their faces. They heard the screams of wounded horses and men, smelled the copper scent of blood mixed with dust, felt the impact as chariot wheels crushed bodies into the ground. Those who survived carried these memories forever. The common soldiers at Kadesh, whose names history hasn't recorded, deserve remembrance. Egyptian infantry included farmers conscripted for military service, serving their required time before returning to fields and families. Hittite chariot crews were often members of the warrior aristocracy, men trained from birth for combat. Some were veterans of dozens of battles, others fighting their first. They obeyed orders, maintained formation, fought and died for causes they may barely have understood, for kings whose faces they might never see. The horses deserve mention too. Perhaps 10,000 of these magnificent animals participated in the battle. They were trained for years, fed and groomed carefully, bonded with their handlers. They died in their hundreds, struck by arrows, speared by infantry, or crippled and destroyed after the battle. Bronze Age warfare consumed horses at an unsustainable rate, requiring constant breeding programs and imports to maintain chariot forces. The economic cost of Kadesh was staggering. Each chariot represented months of skilled labor. Each bronze weapon required ore from distant mines. Skilled smelting and forging. Each soldier's equipment, armor, shield, spear, sword, cost more than a commoner might earn in years. The destroyed chariots and lost weapons from the battle represented a significant fraction of both empires' military budgets. This economic reality, as much as any military consideration, drove the eventual peace treaty. The cultural impact of Kadesh extended far beyond the immediate participants. The battle became a touchstone for ancient military thinking, studied and debated by generals and kings for centuries. The tactics developed and demonstrated there, the use of heavy chariots for shock combat, the coordination of chariots and infantry, the importance of reserves and reinforcements, influenced military doctrine across the ancient Near East. The religious aspects of the battle cannot be ignored. Both Rameses and Muwatalli believed they fought with divine sanction. Egyptian accounts emphasize how a moon ray saved his pharaoh, literally answering prayers during the crisis. Hittite texts invoke their storm god Teshub as granting victory. These weren't mere propaganda. Ancient peoples genuinely believed their gods intervened in human affairs. The survival or death of kings was interpreted as divine judgment on their worthiness. The diplomatic aftermath of Kadesh established patterns that endured for centuries. Royal marriages to seal alliances, formal treaties with specified terms and mutual obligations, border delineations based on negotiation rather than pure military conquest. These became standard practices in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. The Treaty of Kadesh itself was displayed in temples in both capitals, a public document binding both parties before their respective gods. The legacy of Kadesh extends even into modern military thought. The battle is studied at military academies as an example of the importance of intelligence, the danger of overconfidence, and the need for commanders to maintain composure during crisis. Ramesses' rally of his scattered troops while under attack is taught as an example of personal leadership. Muwatalli's ambush is analysed as a near-perfect execution of strategic surprise. For ancient Egypt, Kadesh became a defining moment of Ramesses III's reign. His inscriptions mentioning the battle dominate his monuments, outnumbering references to any other event. When he died in 1213 BCE after reigning for 66 years, the battle fought when he was 25 had become central to his legend. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings as Ramesses the Great, conqueror of Egypt's enemies, favoured of the gods, victor at Kadesh. For the Hittite Empire, the battle was a tactical masterpiece that nonetheless failed to achieve its strategic objective. The empire continued to dominate Anatolia and northern Syria, but never succeeded in pushing Egypt completely out of the Levant. Within a century, the Hittite Empire would collapse during the Bronze Age collapse, destroyed by internal rebellions and invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples. Kadesh itself would change hands repeatedly before being eventually abandoned. The battle's true significance lies not in determining a winner. Both sides claimed victory and both had legitimate reasons for doing so, but in what it revealed about Bronze Age warfare at its apex. The massive armies, the sophisticated tactics, the complex logistics, the diplomatic maneuvering that followed, all demonstrated that ancient civilizations were far more capable and organized than stereotypes of primitive societies suggest. The day the Egyptian chariots fought the Hittite chariots at Kadesh, when bronze clashed against bronze and the flower of two empires' military might struggled for supremacy, represents a culmination of Bronze Age military evolution. It was a battle where individual valor mattered but couldn't overcome tactical mistakes, where brilliant planning nearly succeeded but ultimately fell short, where propaganda transformed ambiguous outcomes into glorious victories for both sides, and where, perhaps most importantly, both kingdoms eventually realized that endless warfare served neither's interests, leading to one of history's first recorded peace treaties. 3,298 years later, the reliefs at Abu Simbel still show Ramesses trampling Hittite enemies beneath his chariot wheels. The cuneiform tablets from Hattusa still describe Hittite victory over Egypt. Both are true, both are false. The real story of Kadesh is more complex, more interesting, and more human than either propaganda version. It's a story of courage and cowardice, brilliance and blunder, triumph and tragedy. It's the story of young men fighting and dying for causes they imperfectly understood, led by kings who claimed divine mandate but made very human mistakes. It's one day in 1274 BCE when the ancient world's two greatest empires collided, and both discovered that victory was more complicated than crushing your enemy beneath chariot wheels. The archaeological evidence recovered from the region around Kadesh adds layers of complexity to understanding the battle that ancient texts alone cannot provide. Excavations at Tel Nebi Mend, the site identified as ancient Kadesh, have revealed massive fortification walls dating to the late Bronze Age, walls that would have been standing during the 1274 BCE battle. These fortifications consisted of earthen ramparts faced with stone, rising perhaps 30 feet above the surrounding plain, topped with mud brick walls that added another 15 to 20 feet of height. The circumference of these defences stretched for nearly 2 miles, enclosing an area of approximately 60 acres. For Ramesses' army to have taken such a fortress by assault would have required siege equipment and time that he simply didn't have. The strategic position of Kadesh itself explains why both empires fought so desperately for its control. The city sat at the junction of two major trade routes, one running north-south between Egypt and Anatolia, the other east-west between the Mediterranean coast and Mesopotamia. Whoever controlled Kadesh controlled the flow of goods, tribute, and military forces through the entire region. The economic value of this control, measured in trade tariffs and tribute from vassal cities, easily justified the enormous expense of the military campaigns. The Orontes River, which flows past Kadesh, played a crucial role in the battle's dynamics that becomes clearer when examining the terrain. The river in this region runs through a relatively narrow valley with higher ground on both sides. During the late spring when the battle occurred, the Orontes would have been swollen with snowmelt from the mountains, making crossing difficult except at established fords. The Hittite crossing south of Kadesh, which allowed them to strike the division of Re, required detailed knowledge of the terrain and ford locations. This suggests extensive reconnaissance and planning, probably involving local guides who knew every crossing point and trail. The timing of the battle, in late spring or early summer of 1274 BCE, was not coincidental. Ancient armies campaigned during the agricultural off-season when farmers could be conscripted as soldiers and when roads were passable, but heat wasn't yet unbearable. The spring also provided fodder for horses and pack animals, crucial for maintaining the thousands of animals required by chariot forces. Campaign seasons typically ran from April through October, after which armies returned to winter quarters and soldiers to their farms. The composition of both armies reflected the multinational nature of Bronze Age empires. Egyptian forces included not just native Egyptians, but also Nubian archers, Libyan skirmishers, and even Canaanite auxiliaries from Egypt's Levantine territories. The Hittite coalition was even more diverse, with Muwatalli calling on allies and vassals from across Anatolia and Syria. Hittite records mention contingents from Aleppo, Ugarit, Azawa, Dardani, Massa, and numerous other kingdoms. Some of these allied forces numbered in the thousands, bringing their own weapons, tactics, and command structures. This diversity created command and control challenges that ancient generals struggled to overcome. Without radio communications or even reliable signal flags, controlling thousands of soldiers from dozens of different ethnic groups speaking multiple languages required elaborate pre-battle planning. Orders flowed through a hierarchy of commanders, with misunderstanding and delay inevitable. The Hittite chariot attack, despite its initial success, probably suffered from coordination problems as allied contingents struggled to maintain formation and follow the overall battle plan. The Egyptian military hierarchy was more centralized but still complex. Below Pharaoh stood his vizier and chief military commanders, typically princes or high nobles. Each division had a commander, usually bearing the title of general, and below them were captains commanding units of 200 men, and squad leaders commanding sections of 50. The chariot forces had their own parallel hierarchy, with chariot commanders who often came from the hereditary warrior aristocracy. This system worked well under normal circumstances but showed its limitations when the division of Re was caught unprepared and the chain of command shattered. The role of Egyptian scribes during and after the battle deserves examination. Multiple scribes accompanied Ramesses' army, recording events, maintaining supply records, and documenting the campaign. After the battle, these scribes worked with royal propaganda officials to craft the narrative that would be inscribed on temple walls. They had to balance the need to document what actually happened. There were thousands of witnesses who knew the truth, with the requirement to present Pharaoh in the most favourable possible light. The result was a narrative that acknowledged difficulties while attributing ultimate success to Ramesses' personal valour and divine favour. Hittite record-keeping was equally sophisticated but served different purposes. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa include diplomatic correspondence, military orders, supply lists, and historical annals. The Hittite king ruled through a complex system of vassals and allies, each with their own obligations and privileges. The military forces these vassals provided to Muwatalli for the Kadesh campaign came with political strings attached. Allies expected to share in the spoils of victory, demanded voice in strategic decisions, and might withdraw support if they felt dishonoured or cheated. This political complexity constrained Muwatalli's freedom of action in ways that didn't apply to Ramesses' more autocratic command. The aftermath of the battle in Egypt reveals how deeply the event affected Egyptian society. Rameses commissioned not just temple inscriptions, but also papyri copies of the battle accounts that were distributed to scribal schools, where generations of students copied them as writing exercises. This ensured that Rameses' version of events permeated Egyptian cultural memory. Archaeological excavations have recovered dozens of these practice copies, some showing the corrections of teachers and the errors of students struggling with the elaborate language. The physical wounds of battle left marks on survivors that modern analysis can detect. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of healed bone fractures, consistent with weapon strikes, arrow wounds that healed but left permanent bone damage, and signs of infection from inadequately treated injuries. Veterans who survived multiple campaigns accumulated injuries that affected their quality of life for decades. Egyptian medical papyri from this era describe treatments for wounds, including surgical procedures to remove arrowheads and techniques for setting broken bones. The psychological trauma of ancient combat receives less attention in ancient sources, but must have been significant. Soldiers who survived battles like Kadesh witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. The close-quarters nature of Bronze Age combat meant looking into enemies' eyes as you killed them, seeing men you knew well die beside you, being splattered with blood and viscera. Modern understanding of combat stress disorders suggests that ancient veterans suffered similar symptoms: nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, difficulty returning to civilian life. The horses that survived Kadesh bore physical and psychological scars as well. Ancient sources mention that war horses required careful training to overcome their natural fear responses, to charge toward lines of infantry armed with spears, to continue pulling chariots even when wounded. Horses that survived multiple battles became valuable beyond measure, their training and experience irreplaceable. Egyptian and Hittite records both document the care lavished on elite war horses, special feeds, regular grooming, even medical treatment that exceeded what common soldiers received. The economic disruption caused by Kadesh extended throughout both empires. The loss of thousands of soldiers removed productive workers from fields and workshops. The destruction of expensive military equipment represented a significant loss of invested resources. The Egyptian divisions that suffered heaviest casualties needed months to rebuild, recruiting new soldiers, manufacturing replacement equipment, training fresh troops. The Hittite chariot forces, though victorious in the field, had suffered losses that reduced their offensive capability for the following campaign season. The diplomatic maneuvering after Kadesh involved not just Egypt and the Hittite Empire, but also the smaller kingdoms caught between them. Cities like Byblos, Tyre, and Megiddo had to assess which superpower would ultimately dominate the region and adjust their allegiances accordingly. The inconclusive outcome at Kadesh meant these cities couldn't be certain of backing the winning side, leading to hedged bets, secret negotiations, and the constant possibility of betrayal. Egyptian and Hittite diplomatic archives preserve letters from vassal rulers protesting their loyalty while simultaneously attempting to negotiate better terms with the opposing side. The intelligence gathering that preceded and followed Kadesh reveals sophisticated espionage networks. Both empires maintained agents in enemy territory, recruited local informants, interrogated captured prisoners and deserters. The Bedouin spies who fed false information to Rameses before the battle were part of a Hittite intelligence operation that must have been planned months in advance. Similarly, the Egyptian scouts who eventually captured genuine Hittite soldiers and extracted accurate information demonstrated established procedures for tactical intelligence gathering. The role of religion in motivating soldiers deserves deeper examination. Egyptian soldiers believed they fought under the protection of powerful gods, particularly Amun-Re, who was considered Pharaoh's personal patron. Before battle, priests performed ceremonies to secure divine favor, and soldiers wore amulets believed to provide protection. The Hittites similarly invoked their storm god and other deities. These weren't empty rituals. Genuine belief in divine protection helped soldiers face death, knowing that even if they fell, the gods would judge them favorably for fighting bravely. The social mobility that military service offered in both empires made soldiers more willing to face battle's dangers. In Egypt, distinguished military service could elevate a common farmer to the ranks of the warrior aristocracy, providing land grants and tax exemptions for his family. Hittite society similarly rewarded military valor with social advancement. Veterans of successful campaigns received shares of booty, captives who became slaves, and in some cases grants of land in conquered territories. These incentives made the risks of battle more acceptable. The treatment of prisoners taken at Kadesh followed established conventions that, while brutal by modern standards, thus were considered normal in Bronze Age warfare. High-value prisoners, nobles, or specialists with valuable skills might be ransomed back to their side or incorporated into the captor's forces. Common soldiers faced enslavement, being distributed as rewards to victorious troops or sent to work on royal building projects. Some prisoners were executed as examples, particularly those from cities that had rebelled against previous overlords. The ancient world made no pretense of humanitarian treatment in war. The evolution of chariot design after Kadesh reflected lessons learned from the battle. Egyptian armories began experimenting with heavier chariot frames that could better withstand shock combat while maintaining mobility. Hittite workshops explored lighter designs that improved speed without sacrificing the three-man crew configuration. Neither side completely abandoned their traditional designs, but modifications appeared that represented compromised positions, attempting to capture advantages of both approaches. The training regimens for chariot warriors intensified after Kadesh, as both sides recognized that crew quality mattered as much as vehicle design. Egyptian training grounds established formal programs lasting years, where young warriors learned not just individual skills but team coordination. A chariot crew, driver and archer, had to function as a single unit, anticipating each other's movements, communicating through subtle signals during the chaos of battle. The best crews developed almost telepathic coordination after years of working together. The metallurgy of Bronze Age weapons deserves attention for understanding how battles like Kadesh were fought. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, typically in ratios around 90% copper to 10% tin, provided a material harder than pure copper, but still workable with available technology. Weaponsmiths understood that different applications required different properties. Sword blades needed flexibility to avoid shattering on impact, achieved through careful control of alloy ratios and forging techniques. Spear points needed hardness to penetrate armor, achieved through higher tin content and different heat treatment. Arrowheads required both hardness and the ability to be mass-produced cheaply. The supply of tin, crucial for bronze manufacture, was one of the strategic resources that partially motivated conflicts like Kadesh. Tin deposits were rare, concentrated in distant regions like Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall in Britain. Trade routes bringing tin to the Mediterranean world passed through territories that Egypt and the Hittite Empire both sought to control. Disruption of tin supplies could cripple a kingdom's ability to manufacture weapons, making control of trade routes a military necessity. The armour worn at Kadesh represented the peak of Bronze Age protective technology. Scale armour, consisting of small bronze plates sewn onto leather or fabric backing, provided excellent protection against slashing weapons while remaining flexible enough for movement. A complete suit of scale armour might contain 600 to 800 individual scales, each requiring manufacture, drilling, and attachment. The labour investment in a single suit of armour was enormous, making fully armoured soldiers relatively rare and valuable. Most infantry wore minimal armour, perhaps a bronze helmet and leather-reinforced cloth, accepting greater vulnerability in exchange for mobility and lower cost. The shields used by infantry were typically constructed from wood frames covered with leather, sometimes reinforced with bronze fittings. These shields, often standing 3 to 4 feet tall, could protect most of a soldier's body when properly positioned. Shield walls, formations of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, provided collective protection that made infantry formations highly resistant to arrows and difficult for chariots to penetrate. Breaking a shield wall required concentrated attack, overwhelming force, or flanking maneuvers. The bows used by chariot archers represented sophisticated weapon technology. Composite bows, so called because they combined multiple materials, used wood for the core structure, horn on the belly which faced the archer for compression strength, and sinew on the back for tension. These materials were laminated together using animal-based glues, then shaped and curved into the recurve profile that provided mechanical advantage. Manufacturing a single composite bow required months of work by skilled craftsmen, and resulted in a weapon capable of penetrating armour at ranges exceeding 150 yards. The arrows shot from these bows were themselves products of careful manufacture. Shafts had to be straight, uniform in weight, and precisely matched to the bow's characteristics. Fletching, typically using bird feathers, stabilized the arrow in flight. Bronze arrowheads came in various designs: broadheads for maximum tissue damage against unarmoured targets, narrow bodkins for penetrating armour. A skilled archer could shoot 10 to 15 aimed arrows per minute, but in the chaos of chariot warfare, effective shooting rate was probably much lower. The medical treatment available to wounded soldiers after Kadesh was surprisingly sophisticated. Egyptian medical papyri describe procedures for treating various battle injuries. Arrow wounds required careful extraction to avoid leaving fragments that would cause infection. Spear wounds, depending on location, might be packed with lint soaked in grease and honey, the latter serving as an antibacterial agent, though ancient physicians didn't understand the mechanism. Broken bones were set and splintered. Serious bleeding was controlled through pressure and cauterization. Egyptian physicians understood that some wounds were inevitably fatal, describing them as ailments not to be treated, focusing resources on soldiers who might survive. The burial practices for soldiers killed at Kadesh reflected both practical necessity and religious belief. The massive casualties, probably several thousand dead on both sides, required immediate disposal to prevent disease. Common soldiers received mass burial in pits near the battlefield, their bodies probably stripped of any valuable equipment first. Higher-ranking casualties received more elaborate treatment. Egyptian nobles killed in battle would have their bodies preserved and transported back to Egypt for proper mummification and burial. Hittite nobles received cremation according to their customs, their ashes interred with appropriate ceremonies. The impact of Kadesh on subsequent Egyptian military operations was profound. Rameses launched several more campaigns into Syria-Palestine during his reign, but never again led the army so deep into Hittite-controlled territory with such confidence. The near disaster of the first day at Kadesh taught caution. Subsequent campaigns focused on securing Egypt's traditional sphere of influence in Canaan, rather than attempting to conquer Hittite heartlands. The strategic stalemate that Kadesh revealed, neither side able to decisively defeat the other, ultimately led to the peace treaty. The Hittite perspective on military strategy also evolved after Kadesh. Despite achieving impressive tactical success, Muwatalli recognized that ambushing Egyptian armies in the field, while effective, didn't translate to strategic control of disputed territories. The Hittite Empire's resources were stretched across multiple frontiers, facing threats not just from Egypt but also from Assyria to the east and various Anatolian kingdoms to the north. Maintaining the massive military force required to dominate Syria meant weakening defences elsewhere. This strategic calculus contributed to Hittite willingness to eventually negotiate peace. The treaty negotiations that ultimately occurred 15 years after Kadesh involved careful diplomatic choreography. Neither king could appear weak or defeated, both needed to claim victory while accepting compromise. The solution involved acknowledging each other as equals, great kings, in the diplomatic language of the era, rulers of equally powerful empires. The treaty text carefully balanced concessions on both sides, specifying borders that gave each empire core territories while creating buffer zones in disputed regions. The mutual defense provisions bound both empires against common enemies, particularly the rising power of Assyria. The marriage alliances that sealed the peace treaty were standard diplomatic practice, but required careful negotiation of details. Hittite princesses sent to marry Rameses brought substantial dowries, wealth that helped compensate Egypt for territorial concessions. These princesses also brought Hittite attendants, priests and craftsmen, creating small Hittite communities within Egypt that facilitated ongoing diplomatic relations. Similarly, though less well documented, Egyptian princesses or high-ranking noblewomen probably married into Hittite royal families, creating kinship bonds that made future conflicts less likely. The long-term stability that followed the Treaty of Kadesh benefited both empires enormously. The decades of peace allowed both sides to focus resources on internal development, trade expansion, and dealing with other threats. Egypt under Rameses entered a golden age of monumental building, with massive construction projects at Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel, and numerous other sites. The Hittite Empire, freed from the Egyptian threat, focused on consolidating control of Anatolia and maintaining its eastern frontiers against Assyrian expansion. The cultural exchange that occurred during this peace enriched both civilizations. Egyptian artistic motifs appeared in Hittite art and architecture. Hittite metallurgical techniques influenced Egyptian bronze working. Medical knowledge, magical practices, religious concepts flowed in both directions, carried by diplomats, merchants, and the royal brides who moved between empires. This Bronze Age globalization, limited though it was, created interconnections that made the ancient Near East more culturally unified than political boundaries suggested. The ultimate fate of both empires occurred long after the actors at Kadesh had passed from the scene. Rameses II died in 1213 BCE after reigning 66 years, outliving many of his children and becoming almost mythological even before his death. His mummy, discovered in 1881, shows a man who lived into his 90s, extraordinary longevity for the ancient world. The Hittite Empire collapsed around 1180 BCE during the wider Bronze Age collapse, destroyed by a combination of internal rebellions, invasions by the Sea Peoples, and possibly climate change that disrupted agricultural production. The great power that had fought Egypt to a standstill simply ceased to exist. Its cities abandoned, its records buried in ruins. The Battle of Kadesh, viewed from the perspective of millennia, stands as a perfect exemplar of Bronze Age warfare at its apex. The massive armies, sophisticated tactics, complex logistics, all demonstrated capabilities that would not be seen again in the region for centuries. The battle also demonstrated the limitations of ancient military power, how even the most successful tactical victory couldn't guarantee strategic objectives, how even the most powerful empires had to eventually accept compromise and negotiation. The soldiers who fought at Kadesh, Egyptian and Hittite, didn't know they were participating in what would become one of history's most studied battles. They knew only fear and courage, exhaustion and pain, the weight of armour in the sun, the dust in their throats, the screaming of horses and men. They fought because their kings commanded it, because their training compelled it, because their comrades beside them depended on it. Some fought bravely, some broke and ran, most simply endured, doing their duty as they understood it. The chariots that clashed at Kadesh, those magnificent machines representing the cutting edge of military technology, were crewed by young men, most probably in their 20s, trained from childhood for this moment. The drivers who controlled the horses, the warriors who shot arrows or thrust spears, the shield bearers who protected their crewmates, all were specialists at the peak of their abilities. When they died, and many did, they took their expertise with them, requiring years to train replacements who might never equal their skill. The kings who ordered the battle, Rameses II and Muwatalli II, were prisoners of their times and positions. Both had inherited conflicts not of their making. Both felt compelled by duty, honour, and political necessity to continue struggles that might have been better resolved through negotiation from the start. Both were capable rulers who ultimately recognized that endless warfare served neither empire's interests. The peace they eventually made, or that their successors made, proved more beneficial than any military victory could have been. The memory of Kadesh outlived everyone who fought there, preserved in temple inscriptions and cuneiform tablets, surviving 3 millennia to reach modern historians who pieced together what actually happened from competing propaganda narratives. The battle's true lesson isn't about who won or lost. Both sides claimed victory and both were partially right, but about the limits of military power, the costs of war, and the ultimate necessity of peace. 2 great empires, at the height of their power, fought to mutual exhaustion and discovered that survival and stability required compromise rather than conquest. The day the chariots clashed at Kadesh, when bronze met bronze and thousands died in the dust of the Orontes Valley, was both typical and extraordinary. Typical because ancient empires fought such battles regularly, extraordinary because this one was recorded in sufficient detail for modern scholars to reconstruct and analyse. The soldiers who died there were forgotten as individuals, their names lost to time, but their sacrifice was memorialised in stone, their battle studied by military theorists for generations. Their story surviving long after the empires they served had crumbled into archaeological ruins.